stay a while and listen. Good evening, step in with me, into the world of a medieval peasant. We're not merely visiting, we're sinking into this world, feeling its weight, the cold and the damp, the endless toils of the body and the mind, and the weight of survival that presses heavily on the chest of every villager. Imagine yourself walking into the village at dawn, just as the first light begins to break the horizon. The air is still thick with the moisture of the night, and you can feel it on your skin, heavy and chill. The first thing you notice is the smell, earthy, damp, a mixture of straw and wet mud. The sharp scent of animal dung, and the smoke of the communal fire that burns at the center of the village. You feel the tug of your boots in the mud as you walk along the path, the earth soft underfoot, and you hear the faint bleating of goats, the lowing of cows. The sky is still dark, but there is a hint of light creeping over the horizon. This is your world, now one of simplicity, yet of constant struggle. The peasants in this world have no time for comfort, no time for anything beyond survival. Their homes, small and cramped, are constructed from wattle and daub, wooden frames stuffed with straw and mud to keep out the elements. The thatched roofs are far from waterproof. They leak during the rain, and in the winter the cold seeps through the walls, making sleep an uncomfortable struggle. You and your family sleep in a single room, the floor packed earth, with no separation between where you sleep and where the animals rest. If you're lucky, you have a small fire pit in the middle of the room that provides some warmth and light. Though the smoke billows and chokes you, sticking to your clothes, your hair, your skin. As dawn approaches, your day begins. You don't have a choice. There is no sleeping in the medieval world. The work of the farm demands your presence. The sun is rising, and the crops won't tend themselves. You pull on your worn shoes, feeling the roughness of the fabric that barely protects your feet, and step outside into the raw morning air. At first, there's the dull hum of the village coming to life around you, people shuffling about, getting their water from the well, collecting firewood from the nearby forest, and getting their animals out of their pens. You join them, heading to the fields. The air smells faintly of damp grass and the earthy scent of freshly tilled soil. There's no time to stop and admire the view. As you walk past the muddy paths, you see the outline of the fields stretching out before you. The soil here is hard, uneven, and rocky. The plough you use to till the land is nothing more than a crude wooden frame pulled by oxen, its iron blade dull and worn. The task is exhausting, repetitive, and the hours seem endless. Each stroke of the plough sends vibrations through your hands, which are calloused and stiff from the endless labor. Your body aches constantly from the repetitive motions, and it feels like the day is one long, aching movement. The work is unrelenting. You kneel in the dirt, pulling weeds by hand, feeling the dampness of the soil seep into your knees. It's back-breaking, monotonous work, but it has to be done. Every meal you and your family will have this year depends on the harvest. Every morsel of food is earned through sheer physical labor, with no room for error. If you fail, the consequences are dire. If the crops are bad, there will be hunger. If the animals fall sick, there will be no meat for the winter. It is a precarious existence, one that is always on the edge of disaster. There is little time for rest. You work through lunch, eating whatever scraps you can find, perhaps a piece of stale bread, a few handfuls of barley, or some dried beans. The food is basic, simple, and not always enough. The rhythms of hunger become a familiar part of life, never far from your thoughts. It's not just the physical hunger that you feel, it's the gnawing anxiety, the constant worry that the next harvest might fail, that disease might sweep through the village. that the winter might be too cold, too long. The day stretches on. By evening, you're back in the fields, harvesting whatever you can. Your body aches. Your hands are raw, your muscles stiff from the unrelenting labor. You watch the sun sink lower in the sky, the last of the light fading away. It's only then that you realize how long you've been working. Hours have melted away without your noticing. The time when you might have been able to stop for a moment and just sit down is long gone. The night is coming fast, and there's still more work to do. As you return to the village, there's a brief moment when you can stop and take a breath. You pass by your neighbors, who are gathering their things for the evening. They, too, are weary, their faces lined with the same tiredness you feel. The sounds of life, people talking, animals stirring fill the air. You return home to your family, who have been busy with their own tasks, cooking what little food you have, repairing tools, and preparing for the next day. There's no time for idle conversation or relaxation. It's just a quiet, routine existence, the same day, over and over, with no end in sight as night falls. You sit down on your straw mattress, feeling the weight of exhaustion pull at you. There's no comfort in sleep. The bed is hard, the air is cold, and the constant hum of life outside never seems to stop. You try to rest, knowing that tomorrow will be the same. The cycle continues, relentless, unforgiving. And yet, despite it all, you survive through sheer grit, determination, and the relentless passage of time. Imagine yourself living this life for just one day. It's grueling. It's unforgiving. There's no room for mistakes, no room for weakness. The physical toil, the hunger, the uncertainty, it's a weight that would be hard for anyone to bear. For most of us, a day in this world would be too much. The medieval peasant's life is one of survival, and not much else. Comfort, luxury, and leisure are things you'll never know. Life here is about getting through the day, making it to the next one. It's easy to romanticize the past, to imagine simpler times where life was supposedly more straightforward. But the reality of life as a medieval peasant was anything but simple. It was a constant struggle for survival, with each day's work bleeding into the next. If you were to live as a peasant in the medieval world, you would not survive a single day without feeling the weight of exhaustion, the stress of uncertainty, and the unyielding demands of survival. The simplicity of life would be swallowed whole by the ceaseless toil, the ever-present threat of disease and hunger, and the unremitting toil that defined every aspect of life. Now, let's move away from the struggles of the medieval peasant and into the turbulent world of one of the most renowned kings of the medieval period, Richard the Lionheart. His name has lived on for centuries, painted as a heroic figure of chivalry, courage, and ambition. Yet, the true story of Richard is far more complex than the romanticized tales of his adventures. The life of Richard was one marked by relentless warfare, family conflict, political intrigue, and an overwhelming sense of responsibility that weighed heavily on him throughout his reign. Born in 1157 to King Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine, Richard's life was always destined to be one of power, but also of tension. As the third son of Henry II, Richard was not initially expected to inherit the throne of England. His elder brothers were meant to carry the weight of the crown, but fate, often an unpredictable force, had other plans. By the time Richard was in his late teens, his relationship with his father, Henry II, had become strained. Henry, a powerful and often overbearing ruler, had not been easy on his children. His ambitious plans for the empire often pitted his sons against each other, and Richard, as one of the younger princes, found himself drawn into the complex web of royal politics. Imagine being Richard at this time. young, intelligent, and eager to prove yourself in a world dominated by men of power and influence. From a young age, Richard had shown a strong interest in military affairs and the martial traditions of the time. He wasn't interested in the subtler aspects of ruling, such as diplomacy or governance. Richard's heart was set on battle, on the glory of the battlefield, and on the honor that came with being a Night King. His world, like that of many nobles, revolved around the pursuit of power and glory through conquest. As he grew older, his thirst for adventure led him to the south of France, where he became the Duke of Aquitaine, title that came with vast land holdings but also with a deepening responsibility to defend and manage these lands. But long before he became king, Richard was already embroiled in family conflict. By 1173, his father, Henry II, found himself facing rebellion within his own family. Richard, along with his brothers, rose up against Henry, in part due to their frustration with his reign and his dominance. The rebellion was short-lived, but it marked a turning point in Richard's relationship with his father. It also solidified his identity as a leader, willing to take bold, sometimes dangerous, steps to secure his place in the royal family. The rebellion failed, but Richard was not one to back down. He quickly learned that in the game of power, loyalty could be fleeting, and even the strongest alliances could fall apart with a single misstep. When Richard finally ascended to the throne in 1189, after the death of his father, he inherited a kingdom that was, by all accounts, in a state of disarray. Despite his turbulent relationship with his father, Richard had the potential to be a great king. However, his reign was marked by war, both within his own kingdom and beyond its borders. Richard's passion for warfare soon led him to the Holy Land, where the Third Crusade awaited. The Crusades were more than religious wars. They were opportunities for kings like Richard to gain honor, wealth, and influence. The call to reclaim Jerusalem from the Muslim forces of Saladin was a mission that captivated the minds of many in Christendom. And Richard, who had earned a reputation for courage and battlefield brilliance, was among the first to answer. Imagine the sheer scale of what this undertaking meant. The armies that gathered for the Third Crusade were vast tens of thousands of soldiers, knights, and men-at-arms from across Europe, all bound by a common cause. The journey to the Holy Land was long, dangerous, and costly. Ships were prepared, supplies gathered, and the great armies made their way across the Mediterranean, with Richard leading the charge. But the journey was fraught with hardships. The Mediterranean Sea was a treacherous expanse, and even the finest ships of the time struggled against the unpredictable weather. Disease and hunger ravaged the Crusader armies as they made their way toward their goal. Upon arriving in the Holy Land, Richard faced the great leader Saladin, a man of equal ambition and military brilliance. Saladin was a formidable foe of Richard's strategy, and just as determined to maintain control over Jerusalem. The ensuing battles were fierce and long, each one testing the resolve of Richard and his men. The siege of Acre, in particular, was one of the most notable and grueling military campaigns of Richard's life. The city was an important strategic location, and Richard's army, alongside their allies, engaged in a long and bloody siege to capture it. The battle for Acre was far from the chivalric ideal that Richard had once dreamed of. It was a war of attrition, a long slog through disease, starvation, and ever-dwindling supplies. Yet, Richard's leadership shone through. Despite the hardships, he remained at the forefront, rallying his troops and refusing to back down. In the end, Acre fell to Richard and his allies, but the cost was high. Many men had died in the siege, and the resources that Richard had hoped to use in further campaigns were severely depleted. But Richard's legacy as a crusader is not without its complications. Despite his military successes, his absence from England for so long left the kingdom vulnerable. During his time in the Holy Land, his younger brother, John, ever ambitious, began plotting to usurp him. John's actions created a rift in the family, and when Richard finally returned to England, he found himself faced not only with the external challenges of maintaining control over his kingdom, but with the internal strife caused by his brothers' machinations. One of the darkest moments of Richard's reign came in 1192, when he was captured by Leopold V of Austria on his return from the Crusades. The capture was a blow to both Richard and his kingdom. It was not just a personal humiliation, but a political disaster. Richard was held for ransom, and the people of England were forced to pay an astronomical sum to secure his release. It was a test of endurance for the English people, who found themselves stretched to the limits of their resources. But even as he faced this personal crisis, Richard's sense of duty did not waver. Upon his release, he returned to England, but the tensions within his kingdom were far from over. His brother John continued to plot against him, and Richard, who had spent so much time away, had to restore his power. Yet, despite the challenges, Richard's military prowess and political acumen allowed him to secure his position once again. As Richard's reign continued, his health began to deteriorate. The years of constant campaigning, the physical strain of war, and the psychological toll of leadership began to take their toll on him. In 1199, Richard was mortally wounded by a crossbow bolt while laying siege to a castle in France. Despite being wounded, Richard continued to lead his forces, but his injury was severe. He died shortly after, at the age of 41. His death marked the end of an era of chivalric warfare, and his legacy lived on not only as a warrior king but as a symbol of the medieval ideal of knighthood. Richard the Lionheart was, in many ways, a man of contradictions. He was both a hero and a man with flaws, a man of courage and ambition, but also one whose actions were often shaped by the burdens of his birthright. His life was defined by war, family conflicts, and the heavy weight of leadership. Yet, for all the glory he sought and the victories he achieved, his reign was one of constant struggle, both on the battlefield and within his own kingdom. The romantic image of Richard as a gallant knight belies the complexity of his reign, where even the greatest of kings were not immune to the difficulties of their time. Now, we turn our focus to one of the most devastating events in medieval history, the Plague of Justinian, the first great pandemic of the medieval world. It struck not only the Byzantine Empire, but also much of the Mediterranean world, leaving death and devastation in its wake. This plague, a haunting reminder of the fragility of human life, would shape the course of history, sowing chaos in its wake and forever altering the trajectory of the Eastern Roman Empire. The Byzantine Empire. The year was 541 AD. The Byzantine Empire, ruled by Emperor Justinian I, had been experiencing a period of relative stability. Justinian himself was a man of grand ambition. He dreamed of restoring the Roman Empire to its former glory, reclaiming lost territories, and securing his place in history as one of the greatest rulers to ever sit on the throne of Constantinople. The empire was thriving, and Justinian had his eyes set on further conquests, particularly in the west, where he sought to reunite the fragmented territories of the former Roman Empire. It was a time of great promise, yet fate had other plans. The plague arrived, unbidden and swift, striking first in the Egyptian port city of Pelusium in 541, where it spread rapidly along trade routes. The disease, brought by rats, and the fleas that infested them, would soon sweep across the Mediterranean. It wasn't long before it reached the great capital of Constantinople, the beating heart of the Byzantine Empire. As the plague spread, it became clear that this was not just another sickness, it was a pandemic of terrifying proportions. Now, let's move away from the struggles of the medieval peasant and into the turbulent world of one of the most renowned kings of the medieval period, Richard the Lionheart. His name has lived on for centuries, painted as a heroic figure of chivalry, courage, and ambition. Yet, the true story of Richard is far more complex than the romanticized tales of his adventures. The life of Richard was one marked by relentless warfare, family conflict, political intrigue, and an overwhelming sense of responsibility that weighed heavily on him throughout his reign. Born in 1157 to King Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine, Richard's life was always destined to be one of power, but also of tension. As the third son of Henry II, Richard was not initially expected to inherit the throne of England. His elder brothers were meant to carry the weight of the crown, but fate, often an unpredictable force, had other plans. By the time Richard was in his late teens, his relationship with his father, Henry II, had become strained. Henry, a powerful and often overbearing ruler, had not been easy on his children. His ambitious plans for the empire often pitted his sons against each other, and Richard, as one of the younger princes, found himself drawn into the complex web of royal politics. Imagine being Richard at this time, young, intelligent, and eager to prove yourself in a world dominated by men of power and influence. From a young age, Richard had shown a strong interest in military affairs and the martial traditions of the time. He wasn't interested in the subtler aspects of ruling, such as diplomacy or governance. Richard's heart was set on battle, on the glory of the battlefield, and on the honor that came with being a Night King. His world, like that of many nobles, revolved around the pursuit of power and glory through conquest. As he grew older, his thirst for adventure led him to the south of France, where he became the Duke of Aquitaine, title that came with vast land holdings, but also with a deepening responsibility to defend and manage these lands. But long before he became king, Richard was already embroiled in family conflict. By 1173, his father, Henry II, found himself facing rebellion within his own family. Richard, along with his brothers, rose up against Henry, in part due to their frustration with his reign and his dominance. The rebellion was short-lived, but it marked a turning point in Richard's relationship with his father. It also solidified his identity as a leader, willing to take bold, sometimes dangerous, steps to secure his place in the royal family. The rebellion failed, but Richard was not one to back down. He quickly learned that in the game of power, loyalty could be fleeting, and even the strongest alliances could fall apart with a single misstep. When Richard finally ascended to the throne in 1189, after the death of his father, he inherited a kingdom that was, by all accounts, in a state of disarray. Despite his turbulent relationship with his father, Richard had the potential to be a great king. However, his reign was marked by war, both within his own kingdom and beyond its borders. Richard's passion for warfare soon led him to the Holy Land, where the Third Crusade awaited. The Crusades were more than religious wars. They were opportunities for kings like Richard to gain honor, wealth, and influence. The call to reclaim Jerusalem from the Muslim forces of Saladin was a mission that captivated the minds of many in Christendom. And Richard, who had earned a reputation for courage and battlefield brilliance, was among the first to answer. Imagine the sheer scale of what this undertaking meant. The armies that gathered for the Third Crusade were vast tens of thousands of soldiers, knights, and men-at-arms from across Europe, all bound by a common cause. The journey to the Holy Land was long, dangerous, and costly. Ships were prepared, supplies gathered, and the great armies made their way across the Mediterranean, with Richard leading the charge. But the journey was fraught with hardships. The Mediterranean Sea was a treacherous expanse, and even the finest ships of the time struggled against the unpredictable weather. Disease and hunger ravaged the Crusader armies as they made their way toward their goal. Upon arriving in the Holy Land, Richard faced the great leader Saladin, a man of equal ambition and military brilliance. Saladin was a formidable foe of Richard's strategy, and just as determined to maintain control over Jerusalem. The ensuing battles were fierce and long, each one testing the resolve of Richard and his men. The siege of Acre, in particular, was one of the most notable and grueling military campaigns of Richard's life. The city was an important strategic location, and Richard's army, alongside their allies, engaged in a long and bloody siege to capture it. The battle for Acre was far from the chivalric ideal that Richard had once dreamed of. It was a war of attrition, a long slog through disease, starvation, and ever-dwindling supplies. Yet, Richard's leadership shone through. Despite the hardships, he remained at the forefront, rallying his troops and refusing to back down. In the end, Acre fell to Richard and his allies, but the cost was high. Many men had died in the siege, and the resources that Richard had hoped to use in further campaigns were severely depleted. But Richard's legacy as a crusader is not without its complications. Despite his military successes, his absence from England for so long left the kingdom vulnerable. During his time in the Holy Land, his younger brother, John, ever ambitious, began plotting to usurp him. John's actions created a rift in the family, and when Richard finally returned to England, he found himself faced not only with the external challenges of maintaining control over his kingdom, but with the internal strife caused by his brothers' machinations. One of the darkest moments of Richard's reign came in 1192, when he was captured by Leopold V of Austria on his return from the Crusades. The capture was a blow to both Richard and his kingdom. It was not just a personal humiliation, but a political disaster. Richard was held for ransom, and the people of England were forced to pay an astronomical sum to secure his release. It was a test of endurance for the English people, who found themselves stretched to the limits of their resources. But even as he faced this personal crisis, Richard's sense of duty did not waver. Upon his release, he returned to England, but the tensions within his kingdom were far from over. His brother John continued to plot against him, and Richard, who had spent so much time away, had to restore his power. Yet, despite the challenges, Richard's military prowess and political acumen allowed him to secure his position once again. As Richard's reign continued, his health began to deteriorate. The years of constant campaigning, the physical strain of war, and the psychological toll of leadership began to take their toll on him. In 1199, Richard was mortally wounded by a crossbow bolt while laying siege to a castle in France. Despite being wounded, Richard continued to lead his forces, but his injury was severe. He died shortly after, at the age of 41. His death marked the end of an era of chivalric warfare, and his legacy lived on not only as a warrior king, but as a symbol of the medieval ideal of knighthood. Richard the Lionheart was, in many ways, a man of contradictions. He was both a hero and a man with flaws, a man of courage and ambition, but also one whose actions were often shaped by the burdens of his birthright. His life was defined by war, family conflicts, and the heavy weight of leadership. Yet, for all the glory he sought and the victories he achieved, his reign was one of constant struggle, both on the battlefield and within his own kingdom. The romantic image of Richard as a gallant knight belies the complexity of his reign, where even the greatest of kings were not immune to the difficulties of their time. Now, we turn our focus to one of the most devastating events in medieval history, the Plague of Justinian, the first great pandemic of the medieval world. It struck not only the Byzantine Empire, but also much of the Mediterranean world, leaving death and devastation in its wake. This plague, a haunting reminder of the fragility of human life, would shape the course of history, sowing chaos in its wake and forever altering the trajectory of the Eastern Roman Empire. The Byzantine Empire, the year was 541 AD. The Byzantine Empire, ruled by Emperor Justinian I, had been experiencing a period of relative stability. Justinian himself was a man of grand ambition. He dreamed of restoring the Roman Empire to its former glory, reclaiming lost territories, and securing his place in history as one of the greatest rulers to ever sit on the throne of Constantinople. The empire was thriving, and Justinian had his eyes set on further conquests, particularly in the west, where he sought to reunite the fragmented territories of the former Roman Empire. It was a time of great promise, yet fate had other plans. The plague arrived, unbidden and swift, striking first in the Egyptian port city of Pelusium in 541, where it spread rapidly along trade routes. The disease, brought by rats and the fleas that infested them, would soon sweep across the Mediterranean. It wasn't long before it reached the great capital of Constantinople, the beating heart of the Byzantine Empire. As the plague spread, it became clear that this was not just another sickness, it was a pandemic of terrifying proportions. Imagine yourself walking through the streets of Constantinople during this time. The bustling market squares, once full of life, are now eerily quiet. The bright fabrics of traders' stalls are no longer being hawked. The lively chatter of the people has diminished, replaced by an oppressive silence. The smell of death hangs heavy in the air. The once vibrant streets are now filled with fear, and the toll of the disease is visible in every corner of the city. Bodies are piled up in the streets, waiting to be carted off for burial. The sound of weeping families can be heard in the distance as loved ones fall victim to the sickness, their fates sealed within hours or days. This was the reality of the plague of Justinian. The disease came in waves, each wave more devastating than the last, and its impact was far-reaching. The symptoms were horrifying. Victims would suddenly develop high fevers, chills, and intense headaches, followed by the swelling of lymph nodes, particularly in the armpits, groin, and neck. These swollen nodes, or buboes, would become blackened and tender to the touch, hence the name bubonic plague. For many, death came quickly, sometimes within a matter of days. In the worst cases, victims would die within 24 hours of the first symptoms, their bodies ravaged by the disease with little warning. The speed of the plague's spread was terrifying. Within a matter of months, entire cities could be wiped out, their populations decimated. In Constantinople, the capital, it was estimated that over 40,000 people, perhaps more, died during the initial outbreak. As the disease spread to other regions, including Egypt, Syria, and the Balkans, the death toll continued to rise. The plague was not limited to the urban centers. It moved swiftly across the countryside, carried by merchants and soldiers. Didn't just strike the elderly or the weak. Even the healthy and the strong were vulnerable. Entire families were wiped out in the span of a single week. The plague did not discriminate between rich and poor, noble and commoner, young and old. It claimed lives indiscriminately, and the very foundations of Byzantine society seemed to tremble in its wake. The spread of the plague was made worse by the fact that in the 6th century, people had little understanding of disease. There were no antibiotics, no knowledge of germ theory, no way to understand or prevent the rapid spread of such a killer. The people of Constantinople and beyond turned to superstition, blaming the disease on divine anger, and sought refuge in prayers, religious rituals, and offerings to the gods. Some believed that the plague was punishment for the sins of mankind, a sign that God was displeased. Others simply had no explanation, and the resulting panic was palpable. It was a time of profound fear and confusion. As the death toll mounted, the political structure of the Byzantine Empire began to crumble. Emperor Justinian, already burdened by his ambitious military campaigns and his attempts to reconquer the West, found himself in the midst of an unprecedented crisis. With so many of his citizens dead, the empire's economy was severely impacted. There were fewer people to work the fields, fewer traders to carry goods, and fewer soldiers to defend the borders. Justinian's imperial coffers, once full from his conquests, began to drain rapidly as the cost of maintaining order in the empire rose exponentially. And yet, despite the immense suffering and chaos caused by the plague, Justinian's reign continued, albeit under immense strain. The emperor, whose name had once been synonymous with grandeur and prosperity, now had to contend with the reality of a population in crisis. In response, he enacted emergency measures to try and maintain control. Officials were dispatched to gather the bodies of the dead, remove them from the streets, and organize mass burials. Public health measures were implemented, though they were largely ineffective due to the lack of medical knowledge at the time. Meanwhile, the ongoing plague waves caused severe labor shortages, making it difficult for the empire to function. Food production plummeted, trade slowed to a crawl, and even military campaigns were affected. One of the most pressing concerns for Justinian was the continued defense of his empire from external threats. With much of his military strength now weakened by the plague and his resources stretched thin, Justinian's ability to defend the empire was severely diminished. Imagine the toll this must have taken on Justinian himself. As an emperor, his duty was to provide leadership, to ensure the safety and prosperity of his people. But, as the plague raged, Justinian found himself powerless in the face of a disease that no amount of strategy or military might could stop. The emperor's personal suffering was not just physical, but emotional. The weight of his failing empire, the lives lost under his watch, and the ever-growing fear for the future of the Byzantine world must have weighed heavily on him. The effects of the plague of Justinian were not confined to the Byzantine Empire. Its reach extended far beyond Constantinople, rippling through the Mediterranean and affecting all of Europe, the Middle East, and even parts of Africa. Trade routes were disrupted, cities were depopulated, and entire regions were left in ruins. Historians estimate that the plague may have killed as many as 25 to 50 million people in total, a staggering number in a world where the population was far smaller than today's. Over the next few decades, the plague continued to resurface in waves. It became a part of the fabric of medieval life, a reminder of how fragile society could be in the face of an invisible enemy. Despite the devastation, the Byzantine Empire, though weakened, eventually recovered. Justinian's reign continued, and though he was never able to fully restore the Roman Empire, he did leave a lasting legacy with his codification of Roman law, the Corpus Juris Civilis, a foundation for future legal systems in Europe. The plague of Justinian was a defining moment in medieval history, a catastrophe that had far-reaching effects on the Byzantine Empire and the wider world. The suffering it caused, the uncertainty it left in its wake, and the challenges it posed to even the most powerful rulers serve as a stark reminder of the vulnerability of human civilization. For the people of Constantinople, the plague was an unimaginable terror, one that reshaped their world in profound ways. For Justinian, it was a test of his reign, a reminder that even the most ambitious of rulers are subject to forces beyond their control. As we reflect on the plague of Justinian, we are reminded of the fragility of life, the impermanence of even the most powerful empires, and the ever-present threat of disease in the world. Yet, as history tells us, the human spirit endures. Despite the devastating effects of the plague, life carried on. The Byzantine Empire, though forever changed, managed to survive, and so too did its people. Now, we arrive at the final segment of our journey, a glimpse into the lavish yet complex world of Charlemagne. One of the most significant rulers of medieval Europe, the court of Charlemagne was a world far removed from the harsh existence of the medieval peasant. One filled with grandeur, power, and intellectual revival. Yet, even within this world of wealth and influence, there was struggle, ambition, and a careful balancing act between loyalty, politics, and cultural rejuvenation. Imagine yourself stepping into the grand court of Charlemagne, the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. The year is around 800 AD, and the once fragmented territories of the former Roman Empire are beginning to reawaken under Charlemagne's rule. The heart of his empire is Aachen, a city that has become the epicenter of political power, cultural renaissance, and military strength. The air here is thick with anticipation as you walk through the bustling streets, no longer quiet and uncertain like the rural villages you've seen, but alive with the pulse of the empire. The smell of freshly baked bread, the clink of coins, and the murmur of courtly conversations fill the atmosphere. As you approach Charlemagne's palace, you're struck by its sheer grandeur. The stone walls tower over you, and the halls inside echo with the sound of courtiers, noblemen, diplomats, and scholars. Rich tapestries hang from the walls, their colors vivid against the backdrop of thick, arched stone. The floors are covered with carpets brought from distant lands, and the air is filled with the faint scent of incense used not just for religious rituals, but as a symbol of wealth and refinement. At the heart of the palace is the great throne room, where Charlemagne himself holds court. This room is a place of both power and artistry, a reflection of Charlemagne's ambition to not only rule but to restore the greatness of the Roman Empire. Charlemagne was a man of both military ambition and intellectual curiosity. As you take in the sights and sounds of his court, you can feel the tension between the outward opulence of the place and the deeper currents of intellectual and cultural renewal that Charlemagne fostered. His empire stretched from the forests of Germany to the Mediterranean coasts, a vast realm that he sought to unify under Christian rule. To do this, Charlemagne relied not just on military might, but also on a profound transformation in the way people thought, learned, and governed. One of Charlemagne's greatest achievements was the revival of learning, an intellectual renaissance known as the Carolingian Renaissance. The revival was not just about acquiring knowledge, but about the preservation of what had been lost in the chaos following the fall of the Roman Empire. The court of Charlemagne became a hub for scholars, monks, and theologians, people who would help preserve and revive the works of the ancient Greeks and Romans, while also creating a new Christian intellectual tradition. Imagine walking into a room at Charlemagne's court, where scholars are engaged in passionate discussions. You see Alcuin of York, one of Charlemagne's most famous advisors, standing at the center. Alcuin, an Anglo-Saxon monk, is known for his wisdom and his tireless work to revive education within the empire. Under Charlemagne's patronage, Alcuin and other scholars translated classical works into Latin, copied manuscripts, and helped establish a system of education that would form the foundation for learning in Europe for centuries to come. You hear the soft murmur of Latin being spoken, a language that binds this world of intellectuals together. There is a sense of urgency in the Iran understanding that this moment of cultural revival is fragile and must be nurtured. The educational reforms Charlemagne promoted were revolutionary for the time. Monasteries became centers of learning, and schools were established to train clergy and noble children in the classics, logic, and Christian doctrine. The Carolingian Renaissance was not merely about restoring ancient texts, it was about shaping the future of medieval Europe. Charlemagne believed that to rule effectively, one had to understand both the past and the future. His court reflected this ambition. There was not just power and wealth here, but a growing respect for knowledge and intellectual progress. Yet, as with all courts, there was a darker side. For every scholar and theologian who graced Charlemagne's halls, there were noblemen and courtiers who jockeyed for influence and power. While Charlemagne himself was a relatively humble man for an emperor, his court was anything but. His nobility were some of the wealthiest and most powerful men in Europe, each with his own fiefdom and army. They were granted land in return for military service, but with that came responsibility. The balance of power in Charlemagne's court was delicate. Those who earned favor with the emperor were rewarded with land, wealth, and influence, while those who fell out of favor found themselves cast aside. The life of a noble in Charlemagne's court was not merely one of ease. Yes, the wealth and luxury were undeniable, but these men were also expected to serve Charlemagne in ways that went beyond mere feasts and festivities. They were expected to lead armies in battle, to protect the empire's borders from external threats such as the Saxons and the Moors, and to enforce Charlemagne's laws and decrees. The nobles were more than just figures of wealth. They were agents of the emperor, and their loyalty was of utmost importance. Despite the importance of these military duties, much of the nobility's power came from their proximity to Charlemagne himself. The most influential nobles in Charlemagne's court were not just wealthy landowners, they were trusted advisors who helped manage the vast reaches of the empire. Charlemagne relied on these men to maintain order within his realm, and in return, they were granted significant power in their own right. To rise in Charlemagne's court, one had to possess both skill and strategy, whether on the battlefield or in the delicate dance of court politics. In contrast to the peasant's life, which was filled with ceaseless labor and the struggle for survival, the life of a noble at Charlemagne's court was marked by luxury, responsibility, and a constant awareness of the need to maintain favor. Their world was a far cry from the muddy fields and thatched roofs of rural villages, yet it was a world fraught with its own challenges. In this court of splendor, every act was an opportunity for advancement or downfall. The nobles who thrived in Charlemagne's court were not merely the wealthiest, they were the most adept at navigating the complex political landscape of the empire. You may wonder, what would it have been like to attend a banquet in Charlemagne's court? Picture the long tables laden with roasted meats, fresh bread, and sweet wine. The air is warm. The torchlight flickers in the stone room, and courtiers gather to discuss matters of state. Music fills the background as minstrels play lutes and harps. The courtiers, dressed in the finest garments, engage in polite but purposeful conversation. Though the lavishness is evident, there is also a sense of tension, a constant awareness of the political stakes at play. Charlemagne himself is there, listening, observing, making decisions that will affect the future of the empire. Even in these moments of apparent luxury, the weight of leadership is never far from his mind. The nobility at Charlemagne's court knew that their position was ever changing. One wrong move, one moment of perceived disloyalty, and it could all slip away. The world of the elite in Charlemagne's court was one of immense power, but also immense pressure. They lived in a constant balancing act, juggling their roles as advisors, military leaders, and landowners, while also navigating the intricate web of court politics. The world of Charlemagne's court was one of wealth, learning, and power, but it was also a world fraught with political intrigue, military responsibility, and the ever-present tension of maintaining favor. The contrast between the peasant's life of ceaseless labor and the noble's life of privilege and responsibility could not be more stark. While the peasants struggled for survival, the elite lived in a world of luxury, but even within that luxury, there were constant pressures and challenges. Charlemagne's court represented the zenith of medieval power, a place where military might, intellectual revival, and political maneuvering came together to form the foundation of one of Europe's greatest empires. And yet, it was a world just as fraught with struggle and tension as the world of the peasants. The elite, for all their wealth and influence, were bound by duty, loyalty, and the fragile nature of power. Thank you for listening. Good evening, *. If you've liked our Wizard Tales, like and subscribe.